Well, we are coming back to Genesis this evening. The last time we were in Genesis was almost 2 months ago. It was before Thanksgiving, if you can think back that far. That's how far back we have to go. At that time when we were in Genesis last, we were in the first half of chapter 45. So you can see on the screen we're picking up in 45 again. That's the section where Joseph finally revealed himself to his brothers. That was the last thing we saw. It was a tearful reconciliation, if you remember, as Joseph's brothers came to understand that the brother they thought they had condemned to die as a slave when they sent him to Egypt, instead was this ruler now that they had been meeting twice at this point, coming to buy grain from, the mighty ruler over the whole land. Not only was Joseph the number 2 man in the nation with food at that time, it was also clear in that passage that he had forgiven his brothers. So when we left the brothers there at verse 15 a couple months ago, we left them amid much weeping and talking. A family reunion had occurred. Going a little further back than that, last June when we started this series, we started what's really the final portion of the book of Genesis. At the time, I entitled this series, Joseph, a display of preserving and transforming grace. That's the series that we've been looking at for several months, and we'll wrap it up here, Lord willing, here in the next couple months. We've certainly seen God preserve Joseph. God moved Joseph from, first he was the hated brother, then he became the Egyptian slave, then he became the Egyptian prisoner, and ultimately the Egyptian ruler. So we watched Joseph go through that progression. And as we've gone through that, we've seen this transformation in Joseph's life. Now, as we come back to the series this evening, we need to remember that this portion of Genesis is structured around around Jacob, Joseph's father. This is actually Jacob's section of the book, even though Joseph becomes the primary character in it. I'll get this right. Jacob is the recipient of God's promises to this current generation that we're looking at. God had established promises to Abraham 3 generations back. Then we'd seen that God pass those promises to Isaac, and then the promises were passed to Jacob. Well, now we're in that generation. The promises that God had made was that he'd select this one family out of all the families of the earth that he would call his own. This family would eventually become a mighty nation, and through that nation, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Furthermore, this nation that would descend from Abraham would eventually receive the land of Canaan. The land of Canaan would become their own possession. That's why it's frequently called the Promised Land. Now, we've seen transformation in Joseph's life as God has been preparing the next generation to take on these promises. But the larger picture is presenting us how God has transformed Jacob's entire family. It's not just Joseph. He's only one of 12 brothers. And he was the brother that the others sold into slavery. How has God been working in all of their lives, transforming Jacob's entire family so that they're ready to receive the promises? Even more specifically, we've seen tidbits here and there how God is specifically transforming Judah. Judah, the brother whose line is destined to rise to prominence in the future generations. Judah is the line that will lead ultimately to the Messiah. Judah needed much transformation. So we need to keep all these larger concerns, how the promises are being passed to the next generation, how the family is being developed, how Judah specifically is being developed. We need to keep those in our minds as we return to our series this evening. Even though I set the series aside for the holiday season, we need to understand that as we pick up here in verse 16, we're picking up right on the heels of the reconciliation event, like minutes after it has occurred. So erase the 2 months that have happened in your mind and go back and say, okay, we're right there again. Joseph has revealed himself. He and his brothers have talked. And with the revelation of Joseph to his brothers, several significant things now come about. First and foremost is a decision. We have the decision to move. You may recall that Joseph has revealed himself to his brothers, and as he did that, he invited the entire family to move to Egypt. This famine that had brought them down by food is going to last for several more years, and Joseph's in a position where he can provide for the family. He's arranged so that Egypt would have food. Egypt will have food all the way through, and he can provide for his family if they come to Egypt. So he has invited them down. Well, the remainder of chapter 45 surrounds the events that culminate in the decision of Jacob's family to move to Egypt. We're going to take the events that they take us to that point one by one this evening. In the first event that comes up is Pharaoh adds in some instructions. We have Pharaoh's instructions in verses 16 through 20 of the chapter. If you have your Bibles open, I'm going to begin reading there at verse 16 of chapter 45. Now, when the news was heard in Pharaoh's house that Joseph's brothers had come, it pleased Pharaoh and his servants. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Say to your brothers, do this, load your beasts and go to the land of Canaan, and take your father and your households and come to me, and I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you will eat the fat of the land. Now you are ordered, do this. Take wagons from the land of Egypt for your little ones and for your wives, and bring your father and come. Do not concern yourselves with your goods, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours." Back in verse 2 of this chapter, we were told that Joseph wept so loudly when his brothers were kneeling before him the second time that he actually, when he sent everybody out of the room and revealed himself to them, he was weeping so loudly that people could hear outside. The Egyptian members of Joseph's household were able to hear outside the room this ruler of theirs weeping. And we're also told there that word was sent to Pharaoh that Joseph was weeping. Well, apparently when the number 2 man in the nation is distraught, the number 1 man in the nation becomes concerned. So Pharaoh checks into what's going on, what's happening here. And Pharaoh learns that the reason Joseph is weeping is a good reason. His family's arrived in the country. Now, I would guess to this point, Pharaoh probably knows very little about Joseph's family. It's probably not as if he ran around telling the Pharaoh that my brother sold me into slavery and because they wanted me dead. He probably wasn't bragging about that, but Joseph is quite important to Pharaoh. Pharaoh has elevated Joseph to his high position. Joseph's responded by saving the nation. I mean, he is the man who rescued the nation from the famine. Pharaoh, we're told, even saw Joseph as his own father. Joseph had told his brothers, "I become as a father to Pharaoh," according to verse 8. And Pharaoh assigned Joseph to oversee his own household. Joseph is important to Pharaoh. You may recall that even beyond all of those things, Pharaoh's the one who arranged Joseph's wife back when he elevated Joseph years before, and Joseph now has children through his wife. Joseph is clearly more than just a servant to Pharaoh. He is the closest advisor, the closest confidant. So when Pharaoh hears that Joseph has a family who came to purchase food, Pharaoh immediately reaches the same conclusion that Joseph had reached. Joseph's family, the entire family, they need to move here from Canaan to Egypt. Come down here because we can take care of them. So Pharaoh states that. They need to move. And 2 times in the verses that we just read, Pharaoh states that they will have the best of the land of Egypt. The best of the land of Egypt will be given to his family. In fact, Pharaoh's instructions are that the family should take food and wagons and everything they need just to facilitate their trip so that they can come back as quickly as possible. Don't even bother with your personal possessions. Pharaoh will be more than happy to provide everything the family needs when they arrive. Reading these verses, we see Pharaoh is clearly pleased to be able to show the gratitude that he has towards Joseph for rescuing the country of Egypt. He's happy to show his gratitude by generously providing for Joseph's family. At the same time, we probably see more going on here than Jacob and his son simply benefiting because of who they knew. Yes, they knew the ruler of the land. That's always good to know somebody high up, right? But there's more going on here. I mentioned at the outset the promises that God had made to Abraham. God had made several unconditional promises. Those promises to Abraham were later codified into a covenant, as we know. And one of those problems back in Genesis 12:3 was that God would bless anyone who blessed Abraham. And then the promises of the blessings went down to Abraham's descendants. It was passed to Isaac and then to Jacob. Well, Joseph is Abraham's great-grandson. Joseph, being a descendant of Abraham, is one who has been greatly blessed now by Pharaoh. As we read this, we likely should understand Pharaoh is enjoying God's blessings because Pharaoh has blessed Abraham's descendants. The promises are in the background here. They are giving a backdrop for everything that's happening. Another thing that we should likely recognize is that Moses, under inspiration of course, Moses intentionally presents Joseph as a picture of God's restoring activity for mankind. Joseph is the redeemer of mankind at this point. He will ultimately serve kind of as a picture of Christ for us. Well, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, God had announced that all of creation was good. In fact, remember at Genesis 1:31, God looks at creation at the end of everything and says it is very good. Sin, of course, quickly mars God's good creation. But in verses 18 and 20, when Pharaoh when he states that the best of land will be there, he literally says the good of the land of Egypt. He uses that word good. Just as God had given Adam the good land in Genesis 1 and 2, this is very good, and then God gives it to Adam. Now Joseph is receiving good land. This is God at work. Now Pharaoh's given these instructions, and that seems to be the reason Moses is including them, so we can see the hint of this larger picture going on. Pharaoh's given these instructions, and now Joseph again comes to the stage, and he adds his own instructions. In verses 21 through 24, here we have Joseph's instructions. Then the sons of Israel did so, and Joseph gave them wagons according to the command of Pharaoh, and gave them provisions for the journey. To each of them he gave changes of garment, but to Benjamin he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of garments. To his father he sent as follows: 10 donkeys loaded with the best things of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys loaded with grain and bread and sustenance for his father on the journey. So he sent his brothers away, and as they departed he said to them, "Do not quarrel on the journey." Since Joseph revealed himself to his brothers, they knew who he was, so now for the first time he could openly give them gifts. He didn't have to hold back at all. So he gave clothing to his brothers. He sent donkeys here loaded with food, donkeys loaded with gifts for his father. He sent wagons to bring everyone back. But above all, he elevates Benjamin, his full brother. And he gives Benjamin both clothing and a substantial amount of money. But beyond all the gifts that Joseph gave his brothers, he gives them these key instructions in verse 24. Do not fight among yourselves as you travel back home to Dad. That's not exactly a literal translation, but that's the message. As you're going home to see Dad, don't fight. Joseph knew that his brothers were looking at a hard conversation. How could they possibly explain that their brother is the ruler in Egypt without having to discuss the great lie from those many, many years ago that they had told their brother or their father when they said their brother was dead? How can he be dead and the ruler at the same time? It doesn't work. In fact, how did he get to Egypt? They were going to have to tell Jacob that they had allowed their father to believe that their favorite son, his favorite son, was dead for decades at this point. They'd watched him mourn for decades. They'd seen his sorrow. And the whole time they knew that Joseph had not been killed by a wild beast. They would have to admit that they'd sold their brother into slavery. Facing that kind of a conversation, it's easy to imagine how on the trip home they might start, shall we say, pointing fingers at one another. How are we going to explain this to Dad? Reuben, it was your idea. Judah, you let it happen. Simeon, you didn't speak up. you could see how they could devolve into all kinds of accusations about who was at fault, who should carry the blame for the great deception. And yet Joseph, he saw this as a time of joyful reunion. The last thing he wanted was his brothers to fight with one another when he himself had forgiven them. He wants them to focus on the future, when the entire family will be able to be together again because God has arranged this to happen. So he gives these instructions, and then he sends his brothers home. In the final verses of chapter 45, we come to Jacob's revival. Jacob's revival. Look at verse 25. Then they, the brothers, they went up from Egypt, and they came to the land of Canaan to their father Jacob. Apparently there's no fighting, because at least nothing's recorded of it. They told him, Jacob, saying, Joseph is still alive, and indeed he is ruler over all the land of Egypt. But he was stunned, for he did not believe them. When they told him all the words of Joseph that he had spoken to them, and when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. Then Israel said, It is enough. My son Joseph is alive. I will go and see him before I die. Well, shall we say when the boys get home they have a bit of a story to tell? They got some news to share. And Jacob's initial response is numb disbelief. He is stunned. The words of verse 26 are literally that his heart turned cold. He just couldn't believe it. Surely Jacob had wished for years to be able to hear somehow that Joseph was alive, but by this point, he surely never expected that to happen. Then to add to the unexpected words that Joseph is alive, you add in that not only is he alive, he's this ruler over all of Egypt. Obviously, the father is stunned, but the brothers are easily able to press the message. They repeat all the things Joseph told them, but beyond just saying, here's what Joseph said, all they have to do is point to all the stuff. Look at all these gifts. They point to the long line of wagons and donkeys that Joseph's given. They showed the gifts that he sent along. There's no way to explain why this man in Egypt would do this if he were not Joseph. The evidence is overwhelming. Joseph is alive. Instantly, Jacob's spirit is revived. After years of mourning this lost son, after decades of sorrow, the joy is overwhelming. The picture that forms, at least in my imagination, is that once the truth bursts over the sorrow in Jacob's mind, it probably took him about a nanosecond to utter the words of verse 28. I don't think he paused real long to ponder what he was going to do. Joseph is alive. I will go and see him before I die. I picture an old man moving with vigor that's been unseen for years, immediately issuing orders to start packing. Boys, we're going to Egypt. Let's get started. Load up those wagons now. Get them full. Pack these tents up. Get the herds in. Wherever they're at, get moving. That's the picture I have in my eyes. This old man suddenly comes alive. Jacob is determined, I'm going to go see him before I die. Now, before we move on, though, notice in the final verse, Jacob is called Israel. Israel is the new name that God gave him. Jacob is moving to a new destiny. He's going off to a new future. Applying the new name here points toward that direction. At the same time, we probably should recall that God had warned Abraham back in Genesis 15, verses 13 through 16, if you want to look. Back in Genesis 15, he had warned his descendants that they would face 400 years, or warned Abraham that his descendants would face 400 years of opposition in a foreign nation. Remember who Moses is writing to, and when Moses is writing. Moses' initial readers, they're the 12 tribes that are forming this new nation that's called Israel, going by that name. And certainly they can read this final verse with some premonition. They know that this move of Jacob, of his family, is the fulfillment of that promise to Abraham that there'd be 400 years of opposition. They know that because they're living on the other side of that. They have endured that 400 years. Their ancestors and themselves personally are the last generation of enduring great opposition as slaves in Egypt. They know what's coming. When the decision to move finally happens, the decision comes quickly. But Moses includes it here in a way that reminds the nation that Israel has a future. We come to the end of chapter 45. We have the decision to move has been made. And then most of chapter 46 simply documents the move. It's time to move. So Moses documents it. Again, there are multiple aspects that are presented, and we'll take each in turn, beginning with verse 1. Verse 1, we have the move, but immediately we hit the first stop. The first stop of the move is Beersheba. So Israel set out with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, "Jacob, Jacob." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again, and Joseph will close your eyes." In Genesis 26, God had appeared to Jacob's father Isaac at Beersheba, and there God had reminded Isaac that he was the God of his father Abraham. Well, Isaac's response to God's revelation at that point in chapter 26 was that he worshiped. He built an altar right there in Beersheba, and he worshiped God. Clearly, we're to catch the continuity in all of this. When Jacob, notice he's still called Israel at the outset here, having packed up everything he had, as starting his journey towards Egypt, as he arrives here at Beersheba, Jacob offers sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. The God of the father Abraham was revealed to Isaac. Now it's the God of his father Isaac is revealed to Jacob. Jacob's worshiping the God of his father here. He arrives at Beersheba and he offers sacrifices there. It's even possible that Jacob's using the same altar that his father built. You know, we don't know if the altar's fallen down or not. Jacob assembled it, put the rocks together so he could offer, or Isaac did, and Jacob may be using the very same idol at the altar. At the very least, he's offering sacrifices to the same God at the same place as his father. And we need to notice that Jacob's worship precedes God speaking in verse 2. When Isaac was at Beersheba, God spoke and Isaac responded with worship. Jacob worships God before God speaks. Jacob's worship was spontaneously offered because he was in a location where God had been worshipped before. It's not a response to God initiating contact through Jacob with new revelation. The new revelation comes after the worship. Still, God does initiate that contact. God does speak. He provides new revelation. God confirms for Jacob that he's doing the right thing as he moves his family to Egypt. Yes, Jacob's moving out of the promised land. But this is part of God's plan. God reinforces that he will make Israel, that's Jacob. God speaks to him as Jacob, but we're being told he's Israel. He will make Israel a great nation while the family resides in Egypt. God affirms that he will be with the family as they go. He will not be against them. This is a significant assurance because Jacob likely knew that God had given his father Isaac the very opposite command. Remember back in chapter 26 is when Isaac was worshiping God at Beersheba. Isaac was considering going down to Egypt at the time, and in verse 2 of Genesis chapter 26, God tells Isaac, "Do not go down to Egypt. Stay in the land of which I shall tell you." So, Jacob's on his way to Egypt, but it's easy to imagine how Jacob would have some trepidation with leaving the land. His father was told not to leave. His grandfather had been told, "This is the land that will be yours." And yet Jacob is leaving the land. He'd set out in verse 1 with all that he had. That all they had informs us that in Jacob's mind, this is a permanent move. He's not leaving anything behind. And now God graciously assures Jacob that that while he will die in Egypt, God will personally ensure that his family is delivered from there at some point. Having stopped at Beersheba to worship the Lord, having received that revelation, Jacob and the rest of the family now continue their journey. In verses 5 through 7, we are fully Egypt bound. Then Jacob arose from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried their father Jacob and their little ones and their wives in the wagons which Pharaoh had sent to carry him. They took their livestock and their property which they had acquired in the land of Canaan and came to Egypt. Jacob and all his descendants with him, his sons and his grandsons with him, his daughters and his granddaughters, and all his descendants he brought with him to Egypt. There are some parallels between Jacob leaving Canaan for Egypt and his grandfather leaving the Ur of the Chaldeans. In both cases, when Abraham left Ur of the Chaldeans, it was in obedience to the will of God. Well, Jacob now is acting in obedience to what God has just revealed. Jacob confidently took all that he had, so had Abraham. You might recall that Pharaoh had specifically instructed Jacob to leave his stuff behind because Pharaoh could just replace what he owned, but Jacob disregarded that and brought all of the possessions that the Lord had given him during his years in Canaan. Jacob saw everything he owned as a blessing from the Lord. And twice in these verses we're reminded that he brought all of his descendants. None of Jacob's offspring were excluded from the relocation to Egypt. The entire family is moving to Egypt. Having shown us that Jacob and the family are now Egypt-bound, Moses pauses. And he includes what I'm going to call the Egyptian registry. Here's the registry of everybody going into Egypt. In verses 8 through 27, Moses includes a family registry for Jacob of the people relocating to Egypt. And it appears as if Moses places the list right here in Genesis 46 so that graphically demonstrates all his descendants went to Jacob. Because you start reading through this list, you feel all his descendants are listed. They all went to Egypt. Now, we are not going to read through the list of names. I fear that would be a bit painful for all of us, especially me being the one that would have to read, but you'd have to listen. So I'll spare all of us. Verse 8 has now these are the names of the sons of Israel. Jacob and his sons. Notice Moses wants to keep both names in play here, so we keep track Israel and Jacob, one and the same. Jacob and his sons who went to Egypt. Then it goes Reuben, Jacob's firstborn. And then we have listed the sons of Reuben, followed by the sons of Simeon, and so forth, and so until we get to verse 15. And verse 15 tells us these are the sons of Leah. In other words, the sons and grandsons through Leah are listed first. Dinah, Leah's daughter, is also mentioned, and we're told that when you put this group together from Leah's portion of the family, we have a total number of 33. The sons of and grandsons of Zilpah, that's Leah's maid that became one of Jacob's wives, they're listed next, concluding in verse 18 with the information that Zilpah's portion of the family gives us another 16 persons. Next comes Rachel's sons and grandsons, and that accounts for 14 more according to verse 22. And interestingly, when it comes to Rachel's sons, Joseph is included in the group. But of course, Joseph and his two sons, who are grandsons of Jacob, they're already in Egypt. They're not traveling with the family here as they come down from Canaan. Then the final group of the children are those descending from Bilhah. That's Rachel's maid, who became Jacob's fourth wife. They give us a final 7 people. All included, verse 26 says that there are 66 persons, not including the wives of Jacob's sons. So we have the male side of the family listed, and that comes to 66 persons. And then verse 27 adds in Joseph and his 2 sons along with Jacob, and it rounds it out to telling us those who came into Egypt in this first generation were 70. In other words, there are 70 names listed from which the entire nation now that's leaving Egypt in Moses' day descend. These are the 70 lines of Moses' great nation. This list certainly shows that Jacob's family entered Egypt as a unit. They came as one unit of 70 people. So I'm sure there's an inherent message there for the much, much, much larger family. Probably, we don't know the size, but probably over 1 million at that point, at least hundreds of thousands moving at 400 years later. There's probably an implicit message there that this much, much larger family is also to see themselves leaving as a family unit. They came down as a unit, they're going as a unit. They are now Israel, Jacob's descendants. Still, I think there might be more to the 70 names listed here than just that unit aspect. I'm going to take just a brief tangent, so I'll warn you, bear with me, stay with me. This will be a little bit of work, but I think it's worth it for us. A brief tangent that several commentators that I read this week pointed out. Back in Genesis 10, we have a section that is the records of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These are the records of the generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah. We know Toledot is how we set the sections, that Hebrew word that means these are generations of. Well, that's Noah's section. We have the listing of Noah's descendants there in Genesis 10. In the listing for each son, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, it ends with a conclusion along the lines of, these are the sons according to their languages, by their lands, according to their nations. For example, Japheth's summary in verse 5 of Genesis 10, that's the first one. And it's slightly different than Ham's and slight variation on Shem, but they all basically have the same type of wording. But that one has the same general idea. These are the groups by their languages, by their lands, by their nations, headed by a person who's in the line of Noah. That's why oftentimes when you read about Genesis 10, that listing there is referred to as Table of Nations, because this is the list from which all the nations of the earth descend. I mean, Noah's the only family coming out of the flood, right? Shem, Ham, and Japheth, everybody's going to descend from them. And as we hit this listing in Genesis 10, and we're told according to their nations, that's telling us all the peoples of the earth come from this group. What's interesting is that there are 70 names on that list in Genesis 10. Now I want you to keep your finger where we're at here, but turn to Deuteronomy 32. Deuteronomy chapter 32. This is Moses' song. This comes right at the end of Moses leading the people for 40 years in the wilderness. The generation that left Egypt has died at this point. They're about to go into the promised land. Moses will not lead them into the land. He will pass away. And Moses writes this song of Deuteronomy 32. It's his final words to the nation. He left them as his final words. And look now at verse 8 of Deuteronomy 32. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, well, Genesis 10 are the nations, right? When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of man, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. Well, Moses separated the sons of man in Genesis 10. That's record of that separation of man into nations. And then God, set the boundaries of the people according to the number of the sons of Israel. How many nations does Genesis 70 have? Or Genesis 10? How many nations in Genesis 10? 70. How many sons in Genesis 45? 70. It seems as if God is doing this intentionally, saying the nations are being portioned according to the sons that enter Egypt. Abraham, in a sense, functions somewhat as a new Adam. And God, through Abraham, is undoing all the destruction that was caused by the sin of the first Adam. God is undoing the destruction through the promises they made to Abraham. The recipient of the curse that was placed on Adam is the entirety of humanity. The 70 nations that are listed there in Genesis 10. those nations rapidly fall into sin, because Genesis, that's right after that, in that same, before, I'd have to look now. But that's where we have the Tower of Babel. We have nations, these nations rapidly dissolve back into sin. But Israel, the 70 sons listed in Genesis 46, they represent a new humanity, one that God is forming by pulling people out for himself. There's much more to the listing in Genesis 46 than a simple registry of who founded the nation of Israel in Egypt. There's a theological reminder that this small group of people is the nucleus through which God is working his great plan of redemption for humanity. He is working out that which will undo all that sin has done. We see that pointing us again to the Messiah. Coming back to Genesis 46, having considered the significance of this registry that's put here, that Moses points us to in his final words, we will conclude on a happy note tonight. A happy note with the reunion. Look at verse 28. Now this is Jacob, he sent Judah before him to Joseph to point out the way before him to Goshen. And they came into the land of Goshen. Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as he appeared before him, he fell on his neck and wept on his neck a long time. Then Israel said to Joseph, "Now let me die, since I have seen your face, that you are still alive." It's a bit of surprise in verse 28 to see Judah pop into the center of action again. He just keeps coming into the thing here to remind us, it seems, that he has a role to play. As I said at the outset, he is the line through which the Messiah will come. So Moses takes pains to highlight God's transforming work in his life, where we clearly see him. He's a leader among the brothers. And now he's the one who points out the way for Jacob and the family to Goshen. By going ahead, he notifies Joseph that the family is coming, they're about to arrive. It just seems like it's another hint that Judah will play some crucial role in God's plan. As soon as Joseph hears that his father is near, Joseph jumps into his chariot and he rides out to Goshen and he meets the family. Joseph is not going to wait for his father to come all the way to his house. He wants to see his father as soon as possible. Again, we have great weeping as Joseph and Jacob are finally reunited. At long last, Jacob says he can now die in peace because he will not go to the grave in mourning. Rather, he's seen this son that he thought was dead, and this son is alive. Now, the reality is Jacob will have 17 more years before his death, but this reunion clearly is the highlight of his life. In fact, it's interesting. God gives Jacob the exact same number of years with Joseph after this reunion as he gave Joseph before the supposed death. Joseph was 17 years old when he was sold in slavery, and Jacob will have 17 more years before he dies in Egypt. But this is the highlight. This is the reunion. Joseph and his father are finally reunited. The family is back together. Yet the question that we need to ask ourselves before we set this section of the story aside is what can we learn from what we just looked at? What can we learn? The families moved to Egypt, but what does that teach us? Many of the sections of Joseph's story have displayed the providential working of God. God is at work accomplishing his plan, and this section really is another one of those. We see God's plan at work. There are several clues that demonstrate for both Jacob and the later larger people of Israel in Moses today that God was the one who moved the family out of the promised land and into Egypt. It's also clear that this move was consistent with the promises that God had given earlier to Abraham. So if we put these observations together, that the God is one moving it, there's clear indication this is what God would have them do, and it's consistent with the promises. We put that all together. What I believe we can learn and apply to our lives is that Often, discerning the will of God is as simple as observing our circumstances while considering the promises that He has made to us. Now, I know that's a long statement. It's a really long statement. So let's read it again. Often discerning the will of God is as simple as observing our circumstances while considering the promises He has made to us. Hopefully we are regularly concerned with discerning the will of God. I would hope that's something that we want to do. As believers, we want to live our lives in a manner that conforms to God's will for us. But the reality is, time and time again, we wonder, how can we know what His will is? How can we discern what God would have us do in a given situation? I know Tim's done a class on the will of God. Years ago, I taught a Wednesday night on it, and yet we still come up over and over. All of us, we want to, how do we know God's will? How can we discern what God would have us do? Well, often discerning the will of God is as simple as observing our circumstances while considering the promises He has made to us. There's two parts to that, if you think through that statement. One, we simply observe our circumstances. When the brothers arrived back in Canaan with word that their brother Joseph was the ruler over the whole land, and they arrived bearing all sorts of expensive gifts, it did not take a lot of guesswork for Jacob to discern that heading back to Egypt should work out well for the family. There's going to be a famine for many more years. Joseph's there with food, and he's wealthy. It's not a hard decision for Jacob to work his way through. And the same is often true for us. Many times there is an option in our circumstances that is obviously a good option for us from a temporal perspective. Yet before we jump and take that option, no matter how appealing it is, in fact, I would say we must consider the second part of the statement. We must consider the promises that God has made to us. God has promised that He will bless His people with spiritual well-being and progressive righteousness, the thing that we want more than anything else to be like Christ. He will bless us when we live our lives as He has directed us to live. That's how we will progress in sanctification, living according to God's Word. So we need to take time to consider whether this appealing option that we see from our circumstances, whether it will help us or hinder us from living as God has directed. Will this option that's presented to us in some sense hinder or prevent us from living out obedience? If it will not hinder our obedience to God, then it truly is a good option. However, if the option that we have will hinder our obedience, then it is not really a good option regardless of the temporal appearance of it. Easy example. We can come up with all kinds, but just an easy example. A new job offer plops into our laps. You're not even looking for it. You weren't out looking for a job, it just fell into your lap. And this job would allow you to make more money so that you could provide for your family. It would require less hours so that you could spend more time with your family. From a circumstance perspective, this looks like an ideal job offer. It's even an offer for something that you would find very invigorating to do. It looks like an ideal job, not just a good job. There's only one problem. The job would require that you work every Sunday. Adding in travel time to and from the job, you could never attend a Sunday service anywhere locally around your home. Yet God expects His children to worship Him. Worship is a core element of the Christian life. So it really boils down to, no matter how good this job looks, as a Christian, this job cannot be God's desired will for you. Often discerning the will of God is as simple as observing our circumstances while also considering the promises He's made to us. That's what we learn from Jacob through this section of Joseph's life. He could see it's good to go down, but God had confirmed through His promises that this is the right move. We need to do likewise. Father, I pray that You would enable us to be men and women who are discerning, Father, we thank you for the lessons, the example, the truths that we can see from the revelation you've given us of Joseph and Jacob's lives here in Genesis. And I just pray now that you would help us to be amazed at the goodness of our God that would work a mighty plan to redeem his people. For ultimately, we are praying in the ultimate Redeemer's name, our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.